The first masterclass of this year's Wish is New Power, using our hyper-connected societies to build a healthier world. Henry Timms is president and CEO of New York's Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts. He's won critical acclaim from the worlds of business and academia for his insights on power and influence. His international bestseller, New Power, co-authored with Jeremy Hymans, combines original research with their decades of experience as movement builders and leaders of cutting-edge organizations. Over now to Henry Timms for his masterclass.
Good afternoon, good morning here. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I want to start today by sharing with you 3 stories about how our world is changing. Story number 1, we all have seen around the world the extraordinary impact of the Me Too movement, which begins with the activist Tarana Burke here. But I want us all to think for a moment, think how the way the Me Too movement used its power is very different than the way people like Harvey Weinstein, who of course was toppled by the Me Too movement, by people like that used their power. So Harvey Weinstein's power was very much top down. He could control the whole industry. He had his hands around a media world. He could completely understand how to shape things, how to shift things, how to move things. There was a survey done at one point which showed that in the last 3 years, the 2 people thanked most from the stages of the Oscars were Harvey Weinstein and God. And think how different that is to the power of the Me Too movement. The Me Too movement is not about one single individual. It's not about the power one person can control. It's about hyper-connected power. It's about the power of movement that spreads and surges all around the world. So as Me Too moves, as Me Too develops, it becomes stronger as different women add their voices. And around the world, it's able to shift and to turn in the moments it needs to. It's the difference between power as a currency, a zero sum, I've got it, you haven't, and power as a current, something that is flowing and moving and surging that you can never truly own, but if you can shape it, you can turn the world in the direction of the outcomes you want. Story number 2, we interviewed a woman who had had seizures her whole life. She had been had these dreadful seizures, and they were so bad that she was worried about her wedding day, because she was worried she wouldn't make it through her wedding without having a seizure. And she went to the doctor, and time again, the doctor didn't give her the attention she needed and just kept downloading prescriptions at her, more drugs, more drugs, more drugs. Until, and she was in desperation, she came across, she was Googling, and she came across a website called Patients Like Me. Now, if you don't know Patients Like Me, Patients Like Me is I think now the biggest patient community in the world. So it's almost 900,000 people with 3,000 different conditions. And as you can see here, each of them is sharing collectively their health data. So if you had a liver transplant, you can find other people around the world who did the same thing. You can build these communities of people who aren't just providing sympathy and support, although that's critical, they're also providing data. This has now become one of the many peer-reviewed papers have come out of this community, and it allows patients to have a great deal more agency in their own care. So the lady we spoke to, who was worried about her wedding, she went on to Patients Like Me, and she saw a poll which had been done by other patients. And the poll was suggesting there was a certain type of surgery that had been very helpful to people with conditions like hers. She found a new doctor, she had that surgery, and many years have passed since then, and she hasn't had a recurrence. Interestingly, too, she's become an ambassador on Patients Like Me, helping other patients navigate the journey she has taken. Now, think how different that kind of power is from the power of the traditional doctor. So we think about the traditional doctor who has his power on high, who has all the expertise, who famously writes these illegible prescriptions that nobody can read and nobody can decipher, who uses all of these Latin phrases that make their world impenetrable. And think how there is a true clash between a profession who has been taught to think in one model, who are being faced now by generations of people who are expecting to have a bigger say in their own health care. And to go a step further on our topic, think for a moment about the challenges and battles we have coming around vaccination. So if you think a if you think if 2020 is the year of the virus, then let us hope that 2021 becomes the year of the vaccine. And think back 12 months, and many of you will know this already, but if you looked at the WHO's 12 months ago, if you looked at their 10 risks they laid out each year, the 10 biggest risks they saw to global health, roll it back a year to 2019, and here were 2 of the 10 risks that they suggested. One was a global pandemic, and another was vaccine hesitancy. Not anti-vaxxers, but vaccine hesitancy, that people would be nervous about taking vaccines in a meaningful way. So think just for a moment about the battle we have coming ahead, not the battle in getting a vaccine. Thankfully, it's looking increasingly likely that will happen, but the big battle coming in getting to people to take the vaccine. And we may have a medical profession who insists that we have experts who have decades of experience, who have white papers and peer-reviewed studies, and they have certifications at the best universities in the world. And for all of that, they are not breaking through. What's actually breaking through, and we are seeing things like measles come back here in New York. The reason that's happening in a large part is because the anti-vaccine movement is so effective. So why is the anti-vaccine movement so effective? What's going on there? And I think one of the really interesting and challenging things we have to recognize is what's going on there is it's actually a very vibrant, engaged community where everyone feels they have a part to play, where everyone has a role, where you're validated, where people are engaged around a cause that you care about. And people all around the world in the anti-vaccine community aren't looking to wait for the Secretary General of anti-vaccine to say what they should do. They're able to come to the world and add their voice on their own terms. So what do these 3 stories add up to, right? I've just told you 3 stories, one of a movement like Me Too that topples men like Harvey Weinstein around the world, one of a patient who leaves aside the advice of her doctors and finds 800,000 allies in treating her own health, and one about a battle yet to come, which is a world of medical professionals who have got the vaccine but cannot work out how to get people to vaccinate. And what those battles are about is really what's at the heart of the work I've done with my colleague Jeremy Hymans, which is to think about the difference between old power and new power. So here's our core argument. Our core argument is that the way to think about the world isn't really about technology per se. It's about how the way power is shifting. And especially as we think about health and the medical world, there is a really dramatic shift happening from a world that was built on old power to a world that increasingly has to reckon with the demands of new power. So let's just look through old power for a minute. In the old power world, and this will be very resonant for the medical profession, power was held by few. It tended to download. It was command-driven. It was leader-driven. It was closed up, right? It had a kind of almost military approach in terms of how it thought about power. And what's beginning to challenge that is the new power world, where power is not held by few but made by many, where it's not about what you download but what you upload, where it's not about the single genius doctor whose great insight changes the world, but about groups of peers who can look to outcomes together. And it's the difference between old power and new power, the difference between power as a currency, I've got it and you haven't, and power as a current that flows and surges around the world. Let me take half a step out of the medical world for a moment, just to strengthen my argument. If you look at almost anything around the world now where you are seeing success, it is almost always now driven by some degree of new power. So let me give you some examples. Think about the unexpected successes of Barack Obama or Donald Trump. Very different politicians. Both came to power working out smart ways to generate the power of the crowd around their unexpected campaigns. Think too, from a new power perspective, think about the movements which have defined our times. Me Too, Black Lives Matter, March for Our Lives, Extinction Rebellion, these big social movements which have surged, the Arab Spring, these big social movements which have surged are very much driven by new power phenomenon. And think too about the biggest businesses of our times, the Facebooks, the Ubers, the Alibabas. They too are driven by the idea of new power. But wait just a moment. Here's another way of thinking about the same thing. If you know this game, this was the biggest game of the 20th century. The game is Tetris. I'm sure some of you will have wasted hours of your life playing it. So Tetris, the biggest game of the 20th century, as a game that really reflects the old power world, right? Somebody else set the rules. It was a top-down game. It was a single-player game. Your only job in this game was order, to make things fit into neat lines again and again and again, until eventually you collapsed under the weight of the game. I've certainly showed this slide to many in the healthcare profession, and they found that idea resonant. And think how different that is to this world. So this is the most popular game of the 21st century. Interestingly, like Tetris, it's a block-based game. But it's Minecraft. The game is called Minecraft, and the rules of the game are very different. This is a hospital which has been built in Minecraft. And Minecraft works, it's built from the bottom up. It's a collaborative game. It's a game without rules. The entire game is people coming together to decide to build things in ways that are on their terms. And just think for a moment about a generation of people who are not living in a world where the world and our institutions operated like Tetris, these top-down institutions where we had limited roles to play. But we have this generation of people now who are expecting to play bigger roles, who expect to shape the world in their own image. So as we started to think about this, we tried to sketch out two mindsets, which I hope can help you kind of navigate some of the challenges you're facing. One mindset is kind of the old power mindset. The other is the new power mindset. So in the old power mindset, this is a way of thinking about the world that biases certain things. It believes in managerialism. It believes a lot in confidentiality. It believes in expertise and long-term affiliation, right? So it had this real sense of the institutions, the experts had all the power. Individuals played very limited roles in very rhythmic ways over long periods of time. I'll give you an example. There's a project called Open Notes, which was a campaign to open up people's health notes so as they could see them alongside their doctors, right? You would think that would be a pretty basic request, but of course it was resisted and continues to be resisted by many doctors. And one of the fears that people had about that was actually that sense of expertise was being attacked, right? That the idea that they had all the power and all the information by opening it up, that confidentiality the old power world rested on was being attacked. And think how different that is to the new power world. So in the new power world, people expect different things of individuals, of leaders, and of institutions. So in the new power world, people believe in things like collaboration, like crowd wisdom, like transparency, like this kind of do-it-yourself ethic where people do their own things. So think for a moment about the network Patients Like Me I talked about a moment ago. That network, that community succeeds because it's based on collaboration, it's based on transparency. People are sharing their own health data with strangers to add to the centralized pot, and it's much more governed in an informal and more self-organized kind of a way. But I want to stop right now and just underline something which is so important to the argument I want to make to you today, which is this. The argument is not old power is bad and new power is good. Right. There are many things in the old power world that could not be more critical. I'll give you an example of my own health history. I had, just before we were going to go on our book tour around the world for the book, about 2 months before that happened, I had an appendectomy. I can promise you the last thing in the world I would ever want is a new power appendectomy. I do not want my appendix taken out by a group of amateur crowd members who collaborate with some tools they've found on the internet to take out my appendix. What you want is someone with 20 years experience who has done this hundreds of times before. Now, that's obviously a light-hearted example, but let's just go back for 1 second to the point I just made about vaccines. And think for a moment about how important it is that the experts of our world are heard. Think how important it is that science and reason win out in the years ahead. And think how unlikely that is unless our old power experts learn to enter the world in new power ways and learn to shape their expertise in ways that take the crowd along with them. So as you think about all of these things, one thing we wanted to kind of frame, we first started writing about this in Harvard Business Review. And one thing we wanted to frame here was how you could start thinking about your own organizations, the organizations you work for, from an old and new power perspective. So I wanted to give you a couple of lenses to that, to be a tool, I hope, to start thinking about the organization you work with and what changes you need to make. So we're tracking two things here. One on the vertical axis is the model. Do you have an old power model or a new power model? So an old power model is, you like Tetris, you drop things down and people consume them. In a new power world, you're creating this kind of participatory world. And do you have old power values or new power values? Are your values very much kind of confidentiality and closed up and expertise? Or do you have values that foster the crowd and radical transparency and greater collaboration? So each one of these quadrants, I think, offers some interesting strategic questions. So let's start at the bottom left, which is what we call the castles, where old power meets old power, right? So this is, let's take a good example, the Nobel Prize. Small group of experts behind closed doors decide who the world's greatest physicist is and hand out their prize. It's as old power as it gets. And a lot of the medical world is living in the old power in the castle section, right? A lot of the medical health community has grown up in the old power model and will need to work hard to shift out of this quadrant. But I'd also note that a company like Apple, of course, hugely successful, is still an old power company, right? It doesn't, just because you're new technology does not mean you're new power. So Apple is actually famously not very collaborative. They're very closed up as a platform. They're very closed up as a company. The way they engage with the world is actually very much about not being particularly open and collaborative, and they've been very successful. Of course, not everyone can be Apple. The bottom right-hand quadrant is the cheerleaders, where you have an old power model but new power values. So your model is pretty much the same, but you're beginning to build these values around the product. So let's take a good example here. Patagonia is a clothes company, right? They sell clothes, but they're starting to treat their consumers more like citizens. They're doing a lot of activism. They're being very open and radical about their own supply chain. They're trying to persuade people that you are more than simply a consumer. You are part of a larger movement. And I think that challenge is one that we all face now. At the top right, we see the crowds, where power meets new power. So you're seeing things like an Airbnb or a Wikipedia. You're seeing these social movements like a Black Lives Matter. And what you're seeing here is when you have an alignment between new power models and new power values, and they fit together in a similar way. And then finally, the top left is what we call the co-opters. And this is where you have an old power, a new power model, but old power values. So think about Facebook for a moment. Facebook is the best new power machine we've ever seen, right? Billions of people exist and participate on Facebook with their own ideas. However, the values of Facebook are very closed up, right? The governance is very centralized. The algorithm is very opaque. The value itself is centralized, not decentralized. So one of the really interesting questions for organizations in this quadrant is how much dissonance there is between your model and your values. So as you think about this 2x2, I encourage you to take it back to your workplace and think about your own organization. Where are you today, sitting on here? Where are you sitting? And then question number 2, where do you want to get to in the next 5 years, right? How are you going to make the shift from wherever you start and wherever you need to finish? And I'll make a prediction. My prediction is this. I suspect that over 95% of the people tuning in today, wherever you happen to be now, in 5 years' time, you're going to want to be in a different quadrant, right? Because I think what we're all recognizing is these trends that even 5 years ago could seem a bit peripheral are actually going to be fundamental to how we are all successful in the years ahead. I wanted to lead now to give you an example from a world that I think is similar to the medical world, about why and how these trends can get hold up, right? So if you buy my argument that we're all going to need to get a little bit more new power, then how is it you think about making that shift and what can we learn? And so I want to take you into an organization that we know well, of course, which is NASA. So if you think about NASA as an organization, they are perhaps the best example of a great technology organization that's pretty old power, right? So obviously they're a terrific technology company. These are literally rocket scientists. But they're an organization that had been very top down, very siloed, and there had been a lot of critique at NASA that they weren't being innovative enough. I'm sure many of your own organizations will have heard that critique, right? Not enough innovation happening. So they tried an experiment. And their experiment was a new power experiment. It was with something called open innovation, which is huge in the healthcare sector. So open innovation, for those who don't know it, is the idea that you invite the crowd to help solve your problems with you. So you engage the
crowd to help solve your problems. So a group of scientists at NASA, they laid out a dozen of their most significant challenges, and they invited the public to help solve the challenges they have. So this is ordinary members of the public alongside the greatest scientists in the world working out how to solve some of their problems. And what was interesting was how many responses they got, how quick the responses came, and how good the responses were. They were really surprised by the quality and quantity of the ideas that came in. And one particular solution stood out. There was a problem in heliophysics around sunstorms. This is a sunstorm. If you're flying through space, you want to avoid sunstorms. And the best algorithm that NASA had, could predict them about an hour or two before, and they got it right about half the time. The algorithm which came in from a normal citizen could predict them 8 hours beforehand and got it right 75% of the time. So the solution which came from the outside world was even better, much better in fact, than the solution that had come from inside the great minds at NASA. So what happened, right? What happened was they had this amazing moment and people got very excited about what might be possible in this new world, but things went wrong. For all of the excitement around open innovation, something unexpected happened, is that there was a real tension between those people who were championing this new way of doing business and those people who were holding on to an old way of doing business. And that difference is one that the academic Hilla Lifshitz-Assaf, who studied this work at NYU, and she was inside NASA for 3 years doing this work. When she looked at all this, what she realized that there was a real difference between mindsets, right? The people who resisted open innovation versus the people who embraced it wasn't because some were older and some were younger. It wasn't because some were better scientists or some were worse scientists. It was simply because they saw the world differently. And she lays out these two characters, the problem solvers and the solution seekers. So for the problem solvers, the way they saw the world was, look, experts are always the answer. They had a great belief in organizational process, and they had a great belief in high control. Whenever she would interview any of these scientists, she would ask them about open innovation. And as soon as she started asking them about open innovation, they'd immediately respond by talking about how many degrees they had or their professorship at MIT. And she noted the fact that she'd never asked them about their qualifications, but their immediate reaction to this idea of all this unexpected amateur existence coming in was to defend their territory. And it's very different than the group of people she called the solution seekers, who actually changed their jobs, created new departments, created new ways of working to get value from the crowd. And what they believed in was that anyone could be the answer. They believed in a much more distributed process. They believed in much lower control. And the difference between these two groups really was crystallized for Hilla in a moment that she oversaw when one of the chief scientists was arguing with the others. And she was saying to them, you have to stop thinking the lab is my world and start thinking the world is lab. And in a way, it seems to me that's a perfect way to think about the mindset shift we need to think about inside the health and medical profession. I want to add one last note on this, which is when people see this, and there'll be those watching now who will be resistant to this idea, we must not cast this as one of two options, right? You can either have complete control or you can have complete anarchy, right? That is a false binary. The interesting space for us to explore is the middle, right? Which is how can we create meaningful ways that create participation that actually do capture value, right? That isn't as easy as just opening up the gates and assuming the right answer is going to arrive. There is a true science to the middle. There is a great science and a great skill for those people who are able to work out how to take advantage of this huge appetite for participation and turn that into meaningful and empirical results. And in fact, that whole category of science in the years ahead is one I think we expect to be very meaningful and could be greatly impactful. Okay, so I want to talk now for a moment about some implications of all this for the wider world. Right, what does this mean for all of you? And I want to kind of finish my talk and then get into the new power section of this, is of course is to answer your questions. But let me give you, I think, three implications for what I think this means for all of us and for the medical profession, the health profession. The first is this, that we in general now are very much challenged by a reality of the new power world, that intensity is greater than favorability. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that for a long time, everyone wanted to kind of have as many customers as they could, as many voters as they could, as many friends as they could. And that logic lasted for a long time. But increasingly today, if you want to stand out, and this will certainly be true of the vaccination campaign which is coming, how do you create not just favorability, everyone thinks it's a good idea, but intensity? How do you really make people think this is important right now and they have a part to play? What so often good institutions fail to do well is give people a meaningful role to play, invite people to play a part in shifting outcomes. And as we think, to give you a frame for that, as we think about the vaccination challenge coming, the idea which is we're just going to tell people they have to vaccinate, we all know that's not going to work. So here's the question. How do we get people to be ambassadors of vaccines? How do we get the networks that we all have more enthusiastic and more meaningful in terms of building intensity around this cause? Number two, the most effective actors blend old power and new power, right? So this is, again, I've said this twice, but it's so important that I land this message. It particularly as we think about healthcare, old power matters enormously. The capacity of expertise and wisdom and experience and science and data could not be more important. But the reason those things are under siege is because they are not doing enough with truth alone. It used to be the case that we could say, truth would win the day, but truth today is on the back foot because it's so much easier to mobilize and to encourage people around falsehoods. So the great institutions of our world need to work out how they can blend old power and new power together. And then finally, and I think most importantly, the way to think about the future is it's a battle for mobilization, right? Who mobilizes best is going to win. And whether that's in politics, the people who can mobilize the most people to fight for their campaigns, to fight for their policies, whether it's in business, right? The companies who can make people feel not that they're just buying products, but they're part of a bigger movement, a bigger idea, a bigger world. And of course, in the healthcare profession, the fact we have all of these people out there, if we can work out some ways to meaningfully engage people in their own health, the health of their communities and the health of our world, that is a huge opportunity. And I do think we've done a lot of work around different sectors. I do think that from the start of this work, the thing we've been most optimistic about is the capacities as we think about health and new power. Because there are a couple of things which we really have in our favor. The first is that there is a true collegiality and community around healthcare, right? You look at people who get sick and you all know that one thing they often feel is alone, right? The isolation compounds the illness. So there's a real opportunity to build support and evidence and science around health outcomes in a very meaningful way. And that's very good from a mobilization perspective. And the second thing is, on a good day, health is not zero sum, right? We all win when health outcomes can improve. And so one of the things I think we have coming is the things that can work in one city can work everywhere. So the global collaboration that we so often actually don't see in fields like health, the global collaboration that is increasingly looking like the only way we are going to be able to deal with things like the pandemic, working out ways for that to become a standard in healthcare so that the silos are broken up and we are open sourcing much more of our work, I think will be a very meaningful way. So with all that said, I want to, in a new power way, give you my email address and my Twitter handle, so you have that in case you want to get in touch. And then I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I have now been sent by WhatsApp some questions, which I'm going to answer. So question number one, and I'll go through these in order so as to be a good, transparent new power leader. Your book is successful and what you say makes sense. That's a very good start, thank you. But are the right people, those who have new power, listening? No, the right people I think are not listening. So I think one of the real challenges we have is that people, particularly people in the old power world, are resistant to these kinds of changes. Even some of the good ones kind of say, oh, this sounds great, it's a good idea, I like the idea of new power, but actually don't make structural changes in their organizations. So the biggest hope I think that we have when we think about new power, the biggest hope we have is, how do we get organizations not simply to say the right thing, but also to shift their structures? So how do you get organizations to start meaningfully changing the way power dynamics work so that you lead to better outcomes. And so I'll give you an example of that. In the UK, there is a group in the National Health Service, which I think is the biggest health service in the world, called the School for Healthcare Radicals. And it's a group that's been set up internally inside the NHS, essentially to foster new power outcomes. What they're trying to do is work out ways of making the world more new power in meaningful ways. And it's essentially like a laboratory inside the NHS to take good ideas and then scale them across the system. So I'll give you an example. There was a new power campaign called End PJ Paralysis. And PJs, I don't know whether PJs is what you wear when you're in bed in hospital, right? So your pajamas. And as you know, as many of you will know, one of the dangers of people long-term stays in hospital is people get bed sores and don't get up enough, and that has all sorts of negative outcomes. So the idea of ending PJ paralysis, the idea was a hashtag campaign. The idea was to get people all around the country coming together to find innovative and creative ways to get people up and about more. And what was so interesting is that campaign was not led in a centralized way, but actually was a decentralized campaign. And people all around the country, in fact, people all around the world have now taken part in ending PJ paralysis. And the reason that campaign works so well is because it gives everyone a role to play, right? So the different hospitals could all work out their own ways of how they can impact PJ paralysis. And so there was one who set up a radio station led by the patients to think about how they could do that. There was another who did a race, I think. They did a race with walkers of the various patients to get them out of bed. And it became this really sort of fun and creative and dynamic campaign that encouraged people to do things in new ways. And I think that's something else we've learned from the new power world, is that too often the outcomes are not rewarding and not enjoyable, right? We just tell people they have to do the right things, eat your vegetables, don't smoke cigarettes, run 3 times a week. Those kinds of prescriptions, they don't really give people a chance to feel validated, to feel successful. And for right or wrong, more and more people are being motivated by the idea they're being validated by different groups. So for new power leaders, I think in particular, one of the reasons we wrote this book was to engage with communities just like this one, and to think about the people in your world who ought to be thinking more about new power, but aren't, and how we can help support them. And actually, one thing we've seen working very well time and time again is people inside organizations, especially people who are kind of middle management, middle to senior management, who get interested in this kind of work and start to lobby their own bosses around how they can start to think about new power more. Because I think once people recognize the ways in which you can start to shift organizations, they can get very excited about how new power works. All right, my next question. Question number 2, where does fake news fit into my new power model? And how can the likes of the WHO use new power to get an accurate, healthy message out? Really great question. So fake news, if you cast your mind back, even when I was growing up, so I grew up in England 30 years ago. And when I was a teenager, if I wanted to participate in the world, I had very limited options, right? There were 3 television stations. There were 4 newspapers. I guess I could try and write a letter to the newspaper, or I could try and call up my local radio station and see if I could go on a phone in. But I actually had very limited means of engaging with the world. And the news, as was then, was controlled by a very small number of people, right? The news was the BBC and then independent television at that time. And then, the radio stations you could get to really controlled the news. Now, that didn't mean there weren't fake things in the world, right? So fake news is not a new idea. There are plenty of governments for decades, for centuries, who have controlled enough of the media to control the news narrative and say things that are completely false. But there is something new today that wasn't true when I was a teenager. And that every teenager today, all of us today, have the capacity to share and disseminate information in ways we previously didn't, right? So all I could do previously when I was a teenager, talk to my friends, maybe write a letter to the local radio station. All of you now have communities online that you can meaningfully influence. All of you now can actually shift the thinking of people close to you. Many of the people tuning into this will be very significant people in your worlds, and people listen to what you say in a way that was just completely untrue even 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. So one of the dangers with that is that we all can start to share things that are not the most reasonable or the most engaged, right? Fake news is often something we all get drawn into, right? We all just share something because it seems like it's provocative or it's outrageous or we're upset about it. And we don't take the time to think, okay, is this true? Is this not true? Is this something I should be sharing or not be sharing? And so I think one of the ways to think about fake news is all of us have a responsibility to think about what we share. Here's an idea which might resonate with this group. What is the Hippocratic oath for social media for all of us? What is it we should be promising not to do, and do no harm would be a good place to start. But secondly, recognizing the power of the medical and the health profession, how is it we can start propagating true news, right? What is our responsibility now to start sharing interesting and meaningful information in ways that do resonate? So the organization Purpose, Jeremy, my co-author, runs it, and I'm a senior advisor there. We're doing a campaign right now working with doctors and scientists around the world around vaccination. And that campaign is not getting them to appear on, TV adverts saying, "Hi, I'm Dr. James and take your vaccine." It's using platforms like TikTok and using platforms like Instagram to create very compelling content which shares reason and truth and evidence-based science in a way that engages people at scale. So I think one of the ways of thinking about fake news is not to focus on the fake news, although we should, but to focus on how we as a group of people working on similar causes can start to better propagate true news. Next question, can old power evolve to become new power? And what advice do you have for people breaking out of the old power model? It's a great question. And the answer is yes. Yes, but it's very hard. So old power models tend to be pretty sticky, and it's hard for them to shift until it's such crisis that it's almost too late. But we've seen some things work very well. One of the most effective things we've seen working is thinking about who the people in your organization are who represent new power. Now, the danger is what often happens with organizations is they hire someone who's like 24 years old, who understands all of the new digital things and comes in and makes everyone feel like a dinosaur. And it's like the disruptor who comes in and says, "This is no good, we have to do it differently, you people all should be put out to pasture." And that archetype is very rarely successful, right? The more successful archetype inside old power organizations is a figure we call the shapeshifter. And a shapeshifter is someone who has a lot of old power credibility, but actually starts to shift the organization in a new power way. So to go back to that NASA story I told you earlier, one of the reasons new power got strong at NASA was because some of the most respected scientists there became champions of new power. No one was going to be able to persuade anybody that they were not taking the science seriously or that they weren't respected, but they used their old power to strengthen new power. And I think particularly as you think about the healthcare world, that's a very good frame to think about that question. Next question, how does Biden's win affect the balance of power? Will his presidency actually mark a return to old power values, or is he tuned in to the success of new power? Really interesting question. So I think one of the concerns I think I certainly had about the Biden campaign was ended up being well founded, which is, did it have enough intensity, right? For all of the polling, which was saying this was going to be a landslide, had Biden actually managed to drive up enough of the grassroots enthusiasm around his agenda to turn it into the kind of victory many anticipated? And of course he didn't. And I think one of the great dangers actually for the Biden administration is that it will become a return to a set of norms that are very important for democracy around respect for institutions, around traditions, and around engagement. But if new power is left on the sideline, if that doesn't actually come with a concerted effort to find ways to offer people bigger roles to play, I think that plays into the hands of the Republican Party, who will be ready, anticipating 2024, to resurge back in with a greater level of participation. So the closing argument I left you with earlier, that the future is a battle for mobilization, I think that's particularly true of politics. And I think it's something that the Biden administration, I hope, will make a great priority. And the cautionary tale for them, of course, is the Obama administration. So one of the great triumphs of the Obama administration was the way that he used new power to get into office. But he didn't use new power much when he was in office. He used it to campaign, but not to govern. And so at the end of 8 years, Barack Obama was hugely personally popular, of course, but he handed the keys to Donald Trump because he hadn't managed to actually mobilize his constituency as a governing function. And I think that's one of the big challenges for governments and governors all around the world. Next question, my favorite example of a business practicing new power. I can give you an answer to that, although the health professional may not have of this. It's a brewery. It's a brewery in England called BrewDog, and they set up essentially a new power beer company. And the way that BrewDogs works is they had equity. They had equity for their crowd, so the people who supported them, their drinkers, became equity sharers in their product. They had these amazing big annual conferences that were more like rock concerts and conventions, and they were annual general shareholders meetings. And they've done a lot of really meaningful work to start to transform the governance functions of a company to make it more participatory and to make people more engaged in their product beyond simply buying a beer. And of course, it's actually a very good pint of beer as well. So I think that BrewDog would be my example. But just to flag a trend that I think BrewDog was ahead of, what I think you're increasingly going to start seeing is individuals and organizations finding ways to give their consumers bigger stakes in their product. So if you look at the company KKR right now, the investment company, a lot of the deals they're doing now with corporations, they're doing something very interesting, which is they are giving the workers of companies a real stake in their success. So you're not just getting your hourly wage, you're also getting a meaningful equity stake in the organization. And I think those companies who work out ways how to truly make people feel like they are owners of the organization, both in actual terms and in metaphorical terms, that ownership stake is going to be one of the superpowers for businesses going ahead. And truthfully, I think also for medical professionals going ahead. You know, you all know this data, but if we can increase patient activation by, tenths of a percentage point, right? If we can do that kind of work, it has a huge impact in terms of outcomes of all sorts of medical interventions. We spend so much time on the things which are prescribed, but if we could add to prescription mobilization, if that was the 1-2 punch of healthcare, that could be very, very meaningful. I have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to answer 2 more questions. Can the new power? I just touched on this. How can the new power model help improve patient outcomes and reduce medical errors? So I think that the new power, the patient outcomes, is to give the patients themselves more to do. I think there's no question of that, which is the part of the way that we ought to be even thinking about how we train people as they become health professionals, is they ought to be trained in new power. They ought to be trained in working out the best ways to meaningfully mobilize people around their health, because if we could do that, we could lead to some huge outcomes. And then finally, thank you for a most practical presentation. My pleasure. How does one change the closed shop and cartel mentality of medical regulatory bodies globally by encouraging the new power ethos? Look, that's a terrific question. There'll be people on this call who have much better answers than I do. But I do think it's the right place to end, which is to remember that for all of the power of new power, if we don't change the superstructures to allow this kind of work, it's very hard to break through. So particularly as we think about the way that regulation works and the importance of regulation, I think the same question remains, which is how do we redesign regulation so we lead to good health and scientific outcomes, but we open up the gate for much more participation. And we mustn't let people fake us with the idea that it's one or the other. It's either control or chaos, because the future for all of this work, I think, is in that middle space where we find ways of making sure that the great superpower of our age, which is participation, to make sure that is pushing us all in the right direction. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to engage with all of you today. I wish you luck in your critical work, and thank you for the invitation.